Welcome to Real Estate Investing Abundance, the show for busy, fulfilled professionals like you to learn how to develop financial independence built on solid, passive real estate investments. Now, here is your host, Dr. Alan Lomax.
Hello, enlightened investors. I'm so delighted to be back with you again today as we explore the wonderful world of retail real estate investing. We've had many discussions about other aspects of commercial real estate, and I am delighted today to be able to delve deeper into retail with Raphael Collazo, who is a commercial real estate agent and author, real estate investor, and a recovering engineer. He is the host of the Commercial Real Estate Academy and the sponsor of Commercial Real Estate 101 Meetup. So, Raphael, take us into the show and share an experience that helped you to be who you are today.
Well, first off, Alan, it's an honor to be here. Glad that we were able to get this together, and I'm excited to delve into all things retail related. But as far as formative times in my life, so I was born in Northeast Italy. My dad is Puerto Rican, and he was in the Air Force as a pediatrician. And so he met my mother in Northeast Italy. So my family is currently located in Italy and also in Puerto Rico. But my formative years, probably one of the more impactful experiences that I've had was related to my times that I would spend with my grandparents in Italy. My grandfather went through a lot in his life. He was born in Northeast Italy prior to World War II. And then after World War II, he left Italy at 16 because there were no jobs available. And so he went to Australia and ultimately worked a lot for the government in, capacities that were, not very fun, right? They would go on these different excursions and they would do work that no one wanted to do. And that was just so that he could gain residency in Australia and ultimately create a life for himself and his family. And so luckily he was able to do that. He met my grandmother and had my mom and my uncles and ultimately made it back to Italy in the late 60s, early 70s, and was a manufacturing manager for a period of time until he retired, and then ultimately became a farmer at the end of his retirement. So, a lot of my fondest memories are being on the farm with him and, him just showing us different things that he's doing. He's a very no nonsense type of individual, one of the most resourceful people I've ever met in my life. He very rarely went to the store. If anything, he bought meats and cheeses and stuff from the store, but all of the other things we would produce on the farm. And so you would always find whatever's in season, he would bring it in and he would cook something and make it into an absolutely delicious meal. And, that was pretty impactful for me because I realized that, no matter the cards you're dealt, like there's ways for you to be resourceful if you really think about it. And no one's going to listen to your excuses, essentially. So those are, I guess, some of the formative experiences. As far as one in particular, there's so many that I don't know if I can isolate one, but really he was a big impact in my life early on.
Wow, what a diverse background, international and also agrarian. And I don't know how many people your age know of anyone who is actually growing their own food for consumption. So, wow, what an experience that had to have been there. A lot we could talk about in conjunction with that, but let's get into real estate. You started out as an engineer and then you moved into brokerage. That is an unusual transition. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I get that question a lot. And then the main question is like, why would you leave engineering to go into any brokerage or an entrepreneurial endeavor? And I mean, the reason being is that, for most of my life, I would say probably around 16, 17, I started getting an entrepreneurial itch. And, I really started my first endeavor in college, my sophomore year. A good friend of mine and I started a pasta catering company called Pasticity. And so we would service, variety of different student organizations on campus. We would go to do luncheons for corporate entities as well. We kind of grew it a little bit. Obviously, it wasn't enough to cover all the bills, but it was something that, grew over time until my graduation, and ultimately had to decide whether or not I wanted to pursue more higher education in the form of a master's or, get a job in the engineering space or pursue the entrepreneurial endeavor further. And so that's what I decided to do because I got accepted into an incubator in Phoenix. And ultimately, we learned about the different ways to be able to, grow and expand a business. Along with that, through that relationship with the incubator, I met one of my mentors who was a financial advisor in town who just so happened to own a restaurant. And he gave me the opportunity to manage that restaurant. And so I learned a lot about the restaurant business, but, after doing it for a while, I realized that it wasn't the long-term play for me. I knew that it wasn't where I wanted to be long-term. And so ultimately I transitioned away from what I was doing in that setting to get into the software space. I studied industrial engineering in college, but I knew that the software industry was one that was very vibrant and there's a lot of opportunities in that industry. And so ultimately I self-taught myself, a few programming languages, and ultimately got an opportunity with a company that implemented software systems for government agencies. The role itself allowed me to travel to Washington, D.C. I lived there for about a year and a half. Then I moved to Puerto Rico. I was there for 2 years on a big software project, then ultimately moved here to Louisville, Kentucky, after Hurricane Maria put that project on hold. As far as the transition was concerned, I'd always been kind of looking to do something a little bit more entrepreneurial after, what I was doing previously. It was a very transitory type of role. So I was moving every other year, and it was just, not sustainable long-term if you wanted to build something of significance. And so the wheels started turning around 2017, 2018. And when I moved to, Louisville, and I saw the potential opportunity in the middle of the country, I figured, let's try to see what I can do as far as setting myself up to be able to, maybe make the jump at some point. And, there's this book I read called Set for Life by Scott Trench that kind of, helped amplify what I was trying to do. Essentially, what one of the biggest lessons that I took away from that book are, your top three expenses are your housing, transportation, and food. So if you can lower your housing costs, you give yourself the runway to be able to maybe not make a whole lot of money the first few years. Like in most entrepreneurial endeavors, it takes a while to build up, the income. So in order for you to be able to do that, having a little bit of wiggle room as far as your budget's concerned makes a huge difference. And so I bought a 4-unit property and lived in one of the apartments and rented out the other 3. And that enabled, the ultimate leap to occur. So that's how it happened. As far as why I chose brokerage, my mom is a residential agent in Arizona, and she started back in 2009, obviously in the depths of the recession, and has been pretty successful over the last 13 years in her respective career. I looked on the residential side and it just didn't mesh well with my personality, and I'm much more of a business/numbers driven guy. So that kind of is where the commercial side came into play, because now I get to deal with commercial clients that are business owners, they're investors, whether they're, individual investors or institutions. And I'm able to kind of speak the lingo a lot more effectively as a result of me being from an engineering background. So that's kind of the reason why I decided to jump, and some of the, steps leading up to when I ultimately did. So
Raphael, it's an interesting trajectory. Starting out any business is challenging, and lots of frustrations, lots of barriers in the way to success on any entrepreneurial journey. One of the important things, as you point out, is building a personal and a professional brand, and you focus primarily on digital marketing. First of all, tell us what's the difference between a personal brand and a professional brand, or are they one and the same?
So that's actually a great question. They can be, I like to blend them somewhat together. I think having some personalization to your professional brand really makes the connection stronger with the people who are ultimately consuming your content. If you're just straight professional all the time, it's harder to connect with someone than it is if you also incorporate some things from your personal life, right? We're all humans. We all have hobbies. We all have interests. We all have setbacks in life. The canvas of life has many colors. And so, being able to, provide the touch of color to your content kind of leads to, building a strong personal and professional brand ultimately. But the way I describe, personal and professional brand building is being able to produce content so that people recognize you as an expert in something, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be a broad brush, right? Because what I try to do, because I'm more so on the commercial real estate side, is I just produce a ton of commercial real estate content so that people know that he's the commercial guy. And I can't tell you how many times I've run into people, or people have messaged me on LinkedIn or other social media platforms, just saying, "Hey, I saw your post the other day. I know I've been following you for a little while because you've been producing a lot of great content. I have a question regarding this." And it doesn't always lead to business, but again, we're in a relationship business. So the more conversations you have, the more people you meet, ultimately opportunities arise. So, I would say, I guess from the start, one of the biggest things is just consistency in how you produce content. And I'm sure with your podcast, you said you've done over several hundred episodes. I mean, that's kind of the name of the game, but it all starts with starting something and being consistent over time.
Just for my own information here, you had mentioned people contacting you via your post, but you also do a meetup group and a podcast. Where are you finding that you are really actually, which one of those three really produces the majority of your contacts?
That's a great question. So the cool thing about doing a meetup group is that you can actually advertise it in a variety of different ways. So one is the physical meetup. So I can actually have a physical meetup and see someone in person. While we're at a meetup, I can record the meetup. So it could be a live stream so people can tune in from all across the country. And we've had people tune in from all across the country. And then you could produce that into a video or podcast format. So that's another thing. So we have the Commercial Real Estate 101 podcast that we created, which is just the MP3 version of the meetup group, has done extremely well. And I think part of the reason for that is the name of it. Commercial Real Estate 101 seems to be, keyword heavy as far as people search terms are concerned. And so, I would say that one's probably been the one that's caused the most conversations. But from a local perspective on the brokerage side, I mean, the YouTube has really been what's done it for us,
Really?
for me at least,
Okay.
because I posted on, Facebook and I obviously YouTube is the second largest search engine in the world outside of, Google search. And so, if you start ranking for some of these keywords when people search on YouTube, your content pops up and it becomes a lot more of an organic form of marketing. So,
Well, that's interesting. Utilizing one piece of content in multiple directions. Really smart way to go there. Because I totally agree. Content is so important, but it can be really challenging developing really viable and useful content, particularly doing it on a regular and consistent basis. Let's get into retail here specifically, Raphael, and tell us how it is that you analyze retail investment properties. I'm sure there's some similarities between that and multifamily or self-storage and so on and so forth. But I'm sure there's also some significant differences.
definitely. When it comes to the way that the numbers, I mean, again, it's return metrics, return profiles. So depending on what return expectations you have, ultimately you determine whether or not an opportunity is worthwhile pursuing. However, the things you look at from a retail standpoint versus self-storage versus multifamily are going to be different. So from a retail perspective, I mean, a lot of it has to do with visibility. So can you see the retail property from the roadway? A lot of times, in particular, if you're talking about certain types of retail uses that benefit greatly from visibility. Accessibility, can you easily access the facility? If it's one that you have to do, go into a back neighborhood and loop around in order to get to, a lot of people are just not going to, the friction, you have to reduce friction when it comes to being able to access the facility. And then obviously traffic counts, and that's super heavy, super big benefit for different types of uses that require a lot of foot traffic, whether that's, in an office setting, maybe they're a restaurant that's close to a lot of office building, foot traffic is going to be a big deal for them. If you're off the highway and you want to be able to have a lot of cars go by so you can see your store, that's also important. Along with that, demographics of the area, depending on what types of uses are in the facility, you're probably not going to put a Louis Vuitton store in an area that, is middle income to lower income. It just won't survive long term. Tenant mix is also extremely important. So, it's an ecosystem. Any type of multi-tenant retail center is going to be an ecosystem. So you don't want uses that cannibalize other uses. Like you wouldn't put 2 liquor stores in the same center because, again, their clients are the same and they're going to cannibalize their sales. So it's not going to be very successful. So, anytime you're looking at these retail opportunities, those are, some of the high level things you look at. And then once you start getting more granular, you got to look at the leases, and the leases are really going to dictate where the opportunity lies as far as, increasing the rents or, if it's gross lease versus triple net lease, so, that's where you start getting a little bit more granular and understanding about where the value add opportunities lie.
Tell us the difference between gross and triple net.
Sure. So gross is typically one flat rate covers everything. So, gross leases a lot of times, at least in our market, some markets are different. I know I talk to people in Dallas and sometimes you'll see it double net or triple net lease with office properties. But here locally, a lot of times the office leases are either gross lease, meaning that you pay one flat rent and that covers your electric, water, janitorial, whatever is associated with your space. That's covered within the gross lease guidelines. As far as triple net's concerned, you pay one flat rent, but that only covers your rent. Then you have to pay your pro rata share of taxes, insurance, and general maintenance for the property. That's typically what you see in a retail setting. Just depending on the markets, obviously that may be different, but in most metro areas, you'll see retail leases follow some form of structure pertaining to, a triple net lease. Sometimes you'll even see a percentage lease, which means you pay a percentage of sales above a certain break point to the landlord if they help you generate more sales, but those aren't as common as triple net.
So in some respects, Raphael, that does coincide with what you're going to find in residential. There are some residential facilities that include utilities in them, not very many. It's not very profitable. I would think it would be the same thing in retail, and I would think most owners would want to move away from that. Is that the case?
Yeah, I would say so. And a lot of times when you see these leases that are underperforming, it's just either the owner didn't know about what the market dynamics were, and that's obviously very common, or sometimes they just want to have the space filled, and they're not willing to put in the money to bring it up to what a good market opportunity could be. I've seen a lot of times where you could have a building in a great location, but it's run down because the landlord just doesn't want to put money into it. And ultimately, tenants are not attracted to the space because it's like, okay, this is a great location, but it's run down. And given the fact you're not taking care of the building, what's the likelihood of you actually taking care of things when things need to be done? And so that can also cause, issues on that front. So, sometimes you see it. We did a deal last year. That was a pretty large deal that had 11 tenants, and I think 8 of them were on modified gross leases, where the landlord was responsible for taxes, insurance, and general maintenance, and the tenants were just responsible for their electric, but the water was still covered by, the landlord. So that's obviously a huge value add opportunity for my client, who ultimately ended up purchasing the property, because, as soon as those leases roll over, you can start restructuring the leases such that they become more of a triple net property. And ultimately, if the tenant decides they don't want to renew, the property had phenomenal visibility, great accessibility, was in a great area as far as the demographics were concerned. So backfilling that space wouldn't have been an issue. So at a certain point, the tenant's going to realize, okay, like if I really want to stay in this area, I've already kind of established myself as within the market. I built up my clientele, which is a big deal for retail tenants. Moving is a lot more difficult in a retail setting than it is maybe in other types of uses like an office use. You're not going to be, tied to an office building as a tenant. You're really just going to follow where the opportunity lies. Whereas with retail, people go to your retail store because they know you're there. So if you were to leave that space, you have to go back, go and continue to build up your clientele again. So it's one of those things where, they're a little bit more sticky than other types of tenants.
In terms of lease terms, in residential, they're mostly year-long leases, and then they renew on an annual basis. What are you finding in retail?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it really depends. I would say if I were to do a general rule, it's usually in the 3 to 5 year range, but it really depends. So if there's a tenant that wants a significant build out on a space, meaning they want the space to be modified for their particular use, a lot of times the landlord would say, okay, yes, I'm willing to invest maybe $100,000 in fitting out the space for you, but I want a 10-year lease. And we're going to make sure that we amortize some of the cost of build out over the course of the lease too. So along with paying, whatever the base rate is, we're going to add on a little bit each month to cover whatever it would have cost me to build out the space. So that's also something. If you're looking at single tenant net lease properties, those are more like investment real estate that you see, like the Walgreens, the Taco Bells, the Dollar Generals, et cetera. A lot of those leases are going to be much longer because most of the time the developer will build the building strictly for that use. And then they'll sign a 10, 20, sometimes 30-year lease with options on the back end as well. So, I would say if you're just looking at a retail center that is, more of a, neighborhood retail center, 3 to 5 is probably a safe bet. When you start looking at some of these larger corporately backed leases, you're looking at, 10, 20, 30 years.
Raphael, you have a whole lot going on and a lot of things that our enlightened investors would like to know more about. How do we get in touch with you?
Yeah. Well, first off, again, thank you so much for, it's been an honor to be on the podcast. It's been having a great discussion. But as far as getting in contact with me, I'm local to Louisville, Kentucky. You could reach out to me via my email. I know we provided it earlier, but it's Raphael@CresantiGroup.com. And then also I've written a few books on commercial real estate. My most recent one was Before You Sign That Lease, the Small Business Owner's Guide to Leasing Commercial Space. And I'll actually be releasing my next book, which is Before You Buy That Building, the Small Business Owner's Guide to Buying Commercial Real Estate. It's going to be part of a series. but that's going to be focused on, the steps you need to take in order to make sure that you're doing the right things as far as, purchasing a property as a business owner.
Raphael, what are the pitfalls of navigating this process of buying and or leasing commercial real estate, particularly in the retail space?
Sure. I mean, that's a great question. I mean, a lot of times when I sit down we can start off on the leasing side first, is a lot of people, when they first, start getting into business, they think, oh, I need a space to legitimize my business concept. But in reality, there's a lot of uses that you don't even need a space. So why get the extra overhead and potentially cripple your business when you could, work towards building up to a point where you can actually sustain, a space, and it can actually be beneficial for you and your business. And so, the first thing that I usually do when I sit down with clients is like, do you even need a space? Like, let's walk through it and get a feel for if you're ready to take on a space, or even if your business use requires it. Like if you're a software developer, why do you need a 3,000 square foot office space or, downtown? Unless you have like a established business that is producing at a high level. I mean, you could develop at home, or, if you're traveling, you have a mobile gymnast, right? You can go travel to your clients and build up that reputation. And then once you build up your clientele, then you can sign a lease for the space. So those are some of the things. Obviously, as you start going through the process of, working with a commercial agent, I think it's very important because they understand the dynamics of the market. There's a lot of times that I work with clients that are like, oh, this is my budget, when in reality, in order for you to even get in the space, your budget needs to be here. Or, you maybe you need to modify your expectations. And then once you start getting into the negotiations of leases, there's different provisions within a lease you got to look for. Obviously, understanding the difference between a triple net lease, a gross lease, modified gross lease, all these different types of leases, so that you can understand whether or not you're getting a good deal, and what are your out of pocket costs on a month to month basis. Those are very important. And then provisions within the lease that require that give you the opportunity to potentially alleviate some of the financial burden if for some reason the business doesn't work out, like a subleasing clause. Those are very important provisions. Along with that, there's HVAC, provisions in there. So like if the HVAC goes out, who's responsible for replacing it? If you're not careful and the landlord passes that responsibility along to you, that could really cripple your business. So that's on the leasing front. As far as the purchase front, a lot of it has to do with educating someone about the financials of actually purchasing a property, because you have to go through lenders, you have to provide proper documentation as you go through the process of purchasing a commercial property. There's, environmental concerns potentially, depending on whether or not you're going to buy an industrial property, or maybe there's been a gas station or some other uses on site that could have contaminated the site. Those are some considerations to consider. And then, going through the process, the due diligence process, similar to what you would see in a multifamily setting, you got to go through the units, you got to inspect all the HVAC, the HVACs in the building, the roof, all the major mechanicals to make sure that everything works well. And then ultimately getting to the closing table and making sure that, once you do close on the property, you can hit the ground running and, expand your business within the space.
Raphael, tell us about one of your major setbacks in life, and it could have something to do with your real estate endeavors or not. But tell us about that major setback. How'd you come through that time, and what did you learn from it?
I think we can go back to the early days of after university, when I took on the opportunity at the restaurant and ultimately the incubator for my business. So, I did that for about 3 to 6 months, realized pretty early on that it wasn't something I wanted to do long term. And I went through a period of time where I was very down on myself and didn't know what I wanted to do. And that obviously affected my production at work and everything else. And so I actually got demoted from manager to, server. And then from there, I just got even more depressed on myself and ultimately got fired from that job. And so when I got fired, I realized, oh God, like I got to do something, because I got to survive. I got to sustain myself. And so that kind of kicked me back into gear and said, okay, I have these marketable skill sets. I have things that I have going for me. What am I going to do that's going to align me in a direction where I can essentially get an opportunity that's lucrative and will, open up new doors for me? And so I started full force into trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And that ultimately led me to trying to get a career in software, in particular on the consulting side, because I feel like I'm pretty good with people. And, being able to convince someone of something that's relatively complex and being able to break it down into component parts, that's always something that came very easy to me. And so I thought, well, let's go the consulting route and let's try to see if I can get something in the software space. And that's kind of led me to the opportunity that I ultimately got with this company. And that's also through me self-teaching myself SQL, and we utilize VB.net. I wouldn't claim to be an expert, but I don't think they were looking for someone who was an expert in those software languages. They just wanted to see someone who could think like an engineer and could problem solve. And ultimately I got the opportunity because of that. So through the firing, through the depression, I would say, over those period of time, I was able to turn that into a new opportunity, and ultimately gave me a lot of opportunities from that. So,
Raphael, thank you so much for sharing your setback and the vulnerabilities that come with sharing that, which also shows us a way that out of those kinds of things, and it's not easy. I mean, people talk about overcoming their difficulties. And you mentioned depression. A lot of people never bring that up. But when you have those major setbacks, it's always an issue. And it's not as easy to overcome depression as what a lot of people think. But you were able to get it together through that. Congratulations on that. And I'm glad to see that you use that as a building block to something better and more productive. Enlightened investors, thank you so much for being with us again today. I've enjoyed Raphael's conversation, and I'm sure you have as well. Join us next time for another exciting and informative episode. Raphael, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks so much, Alan. It was great to be with you.
Thank you for tuning in to Real Estate Investing Abundance, brought to you by Steve Talker Capital, a company working for passionate professionals like you to develop financial independence built on solid, passive real estate investments. As part of our efforts to make the world a better place, Steve Talker Capital contributes to activities and organizations committed to better understand the equine. These endeavors attempt to enhance the human treatment of horses worldwide. Steve Talker Capital, working for a world where all creatures, great and small, flourish abundantly. For resources to develop your financial independence, connect with us at stevetalker.com.